Kate. Okay, I'm gonna put some ear defenders in from work. This sounds weird. It's so I can hear myself better, but I can't regulate my volume then, my vocal volume. So let me know if I go quiet and let me know if I go loud. And I'll try and keep an eye on it. Thank you. You've just missed the prologue, but you can go back and watch that one. And if you've listened to the bit of audio play I've done, you know what happens anyway. Girl, graveyard. Also, I've got a massive TV, so I'm looking up here, not down there. Right. Chapter 1, 722 MD, 11 years after the Restless Night. The noon air was sweet and rich with the summer scents of the blooming flowers. Go away notification. The sun was at its peak, and the clouds were few and thin, that the sky was as open as the vast oceans. The breeze was subtle and swept generously at Elder Akan, who welcomed its refreshing strokes. It was strange, the elder thought, that such pleasant days could accompany such bleak moments as that one. He gazed intently from beneath the great holy willow, the willow half, towards the house of weaving. Countless Druids were gathered around the front of the quaint cottage, awaiting the news they knew would come, the passing of Akan's dear friend, dying friend, hero of Elder's Grove, Harith Relafane. Akan's face was solemn. Strands of his long white hair that had escaped the captivity of his ponytail hung down his well-aged, handsome face. His eyes were shut softly but deeply, as his thoughts raced about his mind. As they slowly rolled open, they revealed to the world deep, light grey orbs of wisdom beyond that of most folk. Both of his arms were coiled around his willow staff, born of the entwined branches of the now dead Rovan tree of Lirsk. Upon those coiled arms he rested his chin, and whistled a sigh of loss to the warm wind. A good man was dying, a better shaman, renowned arcanist, and his best friend. Harith Relafane's benevolence was known to all, and the warm radiance of his glow could disarm most. Akan was thus crestfallen, bereft of Harith's warmth, and woven into his grief was also the certainty that things would now become more complicated. Excuse me. Akan was stood amongst the other 3 elders of Elder's Grove. The youngest of these by far was Rudyard. The gaunt, dark-haired man leant in dangerously close to Akan, whispering so that only he could hear. If the riders found a Cavalian on the road, he would be back by now. Akan dismissed Rudyard's concerns with a mild shake of his head. Gonna sneeze. Hey, Fever! Cavalian will be here with all haste, have no doubt. Rudyard bowed. Thank you. Rudyard bowed to Akan's superior wisdom and did not pursue the matter. Akan's gaze was then once more seconded to the house of weaving. There were only murmurs from the 3 dozen or so people gathered outside the cottage school of Arcane. Therein its practices were only tolerated due to the enduring mutual love between Harithon and the Druidic settlement of Elder's Grove. Unlike most Kefik, Harithon's respect came in the form of his benevolent vigilance of their interests, and for that he was more than tolerated. He was honoured, and he was honoured no greater than on that dark morning. They celebrated the beloved man's failing health in praises, song, and endearing farewells, as was the Druidic way. Other children offered their respect in silence, while throwing green roses at the door of the house of weaving, given to them by the older female members of their society. The youngest of the Druids ran throughout the crowds, chasing one another, laughing, oblivious to woe, and then unbridled by adult intervention. Ortego Raslan was the oldest of Harithon's 5 pupils, and yet he was by far the least adept bar one. His shaggy, sandy hair was no more groomed than anyone else's, but with him It, as Aurelil often commented, was as though he made the effort to keep it unkempt. Entwined into his mane, a druidic hairpiece of knotted twigs that may have once resembled a willow hung down from his earlobe. He wore brown robes, open, revealing a discoloured yellowing undershirt and green leggings with several small red patches sewn into them. Already, holding him up from the bottom of it all were short worn leather boots that were indeed in dire need of repairs. His head was lowered in sorrow, and despite his lean frame, this lent a roll of fat to his chin and neck that were more in line with his noticeably bulbous belly than his skinny arms. His brown eyes had reddened his stubbly cheeks, as was warranted when Akan informed them that Hereford's time in the world was drawing to a close. If only he had listened more to his Magister, and tidied more, and been more productive, and just generally been there more for him. Time was always a fleeting enemy of Ortogor's, but he hadn't expected it to take the invincible Haraphan away before the student had even learned to produce fire from his palm. He stood, arms folded, regretful, and leant against the wall beside the closed door of Haraphan's room. It was one of 4 doors in the short corridor, 2 being on each side. The wooden walls seemed as new as the day they were nailed in place, although that was not overly long ago in the grand scheme of things. But between each pair of rooms there was a short cul-de-sac. One led to a small table below a window, where shelves were stationed, filled with vases of flowers and half-read and now neglected books. The other was littered with old sacks of grain, herbs, and a chest of many small drawers containing more varied ingredients. There was a ladder in the attic at one end of the corridor, and the steps going downstairs to the ground floor at the other. Ortogor remained there with his turned head fixed on the door, glaring at the foreboding sealed portal. How many opportunities were now closed to Ortogor like that door? If only he'd focus more, as Aurelil and Cavalian kept telling him. From the top of the stairs near Ortogor, a prolonged note of grief came from Estage, who had begun to cry. In all his meanderings, Ortogor had completely forgotten about the 6-year-old arcanist. He rushed to Estage, just catching a glimpse of Mondol near the window of one of those short cul-de-sacs, tapping his fingers on the shelf beside him. Excuse me for the snivelling. Mondol scratched the curly, dark hair of his head with his chubby fingers. His stubble was perhaps the first he had, and he had appeared loath to shave it, leaving Ortogor to openly speculate that he didn't know how. Ortogor had offered to show him, but simply got a wave of abuse from Mondon for even suggesting he needed to be shown. Mondon was the more troublesome student of the House of Weaving. He gazed out the window then, whilst lazily wrapped within one of the curtains in a failing bid to hide himself from any who might look back, with his thoughts racing amidst the weeping of an inconsolable young Estage nearby. His round brown eyes were fixed on the gathered druids below outside, and across from them the 4 elders stared on in silence at the mound beneath the glorious willow half. "I can't stand the mood in here," Mondon mumbled. "I need to get out. Out there, there's druids gathered like crows on a tree waiting for death, and in the back garden, there are the actual crows gathered on a tree waiting for death." He sighed deeply. "Now Estage won't shut up. Estage, shut up, please." That's enough, Mondon," Ortogor bemoaned quietly as so not to disturb Haraphan. He reached for Estage and took his hand, and then knelt before him in the middle of the corridor. Mondon shriveled his face up as he nosed outside. "Not enough, Mondon," he mocked quietly. Stidge, as he was nicknamed by all but Haraphan, was a little taller than a lad of his age was, the only student of Haraphan's that was of Avarian descent, or Druidic, as the Avarians themselves would say. No doubt exclusively due to his age, he alone wielded arcane weaves at a lesser skill than Ortogor. Haraphan and Estage had come to grow very fond of one another, and quite understandably Estage had been devastated to hear the news. That said, not long after Haraphan had fallen ill, Estage had been told he would need to stay out of the room after only a brief conversation with Haraphan. Ortogor had noted that in all the mania and confusion, the druidic student had been sidelined for much of the day, Estage could confine his perplexed fear and sorrow no more, and let loose his woes in one steady stream of tears and coos. Ortogor would tend to him. Just gonna change me fonts there. Sorry, one moment. Oh, God. Is he going to be like this for the whole journey? Sorry about that. Oh, God. Let's get back to normality. I might as well take this moment to have a drink. Oh, no, Stidgy, he said, embracing the child. But tomorrow will be a little bit easier, and the day after that, it'll be a bit easier again, and again, and again. And this goes on for a while until one day you can look back at Harrowfin and it won't even hurt. Estage stared at Ortogor, somewhat engaged. His normally pale face was bright and red and tear-stricken. His curly ginger hair was short and neat, unlike most of the others. His eyes were engaged, youthful, and the ocean blue colour of them had a pleasing clouding to them that were enchanting to behold. Ortogor was trapped in those eyes in that moment, for although they were rich and beautiful, the storm of sadness that flailed within was more apparent. Ortogor could simply nod faintly to his own words, reassuring Estage. But today will be the worst day, Ortogor unwisely added. Estage's face shriveled up again. You silly goat, Ortogor, came the dissatisfied taunts of Mondon, listening behind him, which was partially washed out for Estage's mourning again. But I'm sad too, Ortogor reasoned on, and so is Aurelil, and that's why we need each other right now. If we all share this pain, we all find it a bit easier to carry. Understand? I will help you carry the weight of Harrowfin's passion if you help me to do the same. Estage's eyes then widened in horror. He's dead? Silly goat, Mondon weighed in again. His ears absently drifted about the conversation and his eyes darted all about outside. No, Ortogor assured the young druid. Not at all. He's fine. Fine? Echoed the now hopeful Estage. His accent was somewhat broken between the Kefik-originated arcanists of the House of Weaving and the druidic locals. Not fine, but he's not dead. Soon, perhaps. Estage was unsure of what he was listening to anymore, but when it didn't sound hopeful, it sounded crushing, and the look in Ortogor's desperate eyes and wild stammering did more crushing than it gave hope. And so, in conclusion, Estage felt a bit, howling in misery again, and now more so than before. Mondon stormed past Ortogor. You're a fucking imbecile, Ortogor, he huffed as he shouldered past, knocking into him before trotting down the stairs. Sod this. I'm off to find Cavalion if anyone cares. His footsteps could be heard crossing over the stone flags of the ground floor. Seconds later, and the back door could be heard squealing open and then slamming shut hard. It was likely for the best, Ortogor thought. I have muted me thing, and it's just not muting, so I'm going to turn my phone off. Oh, wait. No. Silent feature. Take it back. Aurelil was sat at Harrowfin's desk. Curtains waved before her, and the sunshine blazed throughout in small... I'll start this again. I'm going to sneeze. It's in my head in. Sorry. Just got to grab a tissue. Don't see that on fucking other YouTube fucking read-throughs. Oh, I'm going all dizzy. Thank you. Hey, Fever, can we fuck off? I'm going to do it, don't worry. It's probably just not as professionally as I'd hoped. And I've got some rum medicine. Aurelil was sat in Hierophant's desk. Curtains wavered before her, and the sunshine blazed through in a swaying, narrow crack that slowly crossed the room one way, then crossed the room one way, then. Yes, that was right. Sorry. Curtains wavered before her, and the sunshine blazed through in a swaying, narrow crack that slowly crossed the room one way, then, slowly so, the other. Hierophant's mirror before her shielded her moistened dark eyes from its rays, and further lit her golden locks. She sat braiding her hair into the tight curls about the back of her head, wearing the same lackluster brown robes as the others. As with the other students, her rosy cheeks were now reddened more so by her grief, and yet even then her face remained cold and stern. To lose one father to guilt and ale, only to find another that was every bit of a father as she desired to be a daughter, to then lose him too. The ongoing crying of Vestige in the corridor did not drag her out of that dark room, or the darker thoughts she found herself now wandering through. She had always felt the other students remained in the house of weaving because Hierophant had saw some measure of talent in them, and that she was simply there to be loved and to cook and to clean after the boys. Hierophant had never imposed such conditions on her, nor did he ever ask. But neither was Hierophant entirely interested in the state of the place, and only her and Vestige appeared to care. But what had stolen Hierophant from her? It had happened so fast. Speculation was rife outside, she knew. Strangers from reviled western Navaria regions, the Gylock Peninsula, had showed up on horse. Delegates of the arcane enclave, despised by most Navarians beyond the peninsula, had arrived and entered talks with Hierophant's most talented pupil, Cavalian. Only hours later, Cavalian was happy to put behind him his debts to Hierophant, and there were many, to leave the quaint house of weaving. It was Cavalian's intent to relocate to Lirsk and study there in a less dormant school, as he had called the house of weaving in a bout of anger. Hierophant's ensuing illness was therefore laid at the feet of Cavalian, who some went as far as to suggest had poisoned Hierophant. It was nonsense, to be sure. More than just a pupil, like Aurelil, Hierophant was something of a stepfather to Cavalian, and for all her courtesies and selflessness, Hierophant favoured his time with Cavalian, whose talent was regarded by most in Gylock, and no doubt by Hierophant himself, almost unique in their natural quality. But Druids were a suspicious lot, and were it not for the heroics of Hierophant during the Munar calamity, even someone as benevolent as he would not find welcome so far east had they command over the realms of Arcane. And yet, something between that last exchange between Cavalian and Hierophant that the entire village had heard, and Cavalian's departure that very night had come to pass. Excuse me. Some malevolent stroke of evil or dire misfortune had struck the old Magister down with fiendish efficiency. With Cavalian leaving the school and Hierophant now leaving the world, what would she do with her other pupils? She mustered up the courage to try yet again to do what she had tried to do many times already. She dropped her hands from her nearly finished braids and took in a deep breath of courage. She turned to her right to a large bed. Upon it, Hierophant Relafane remained lifeless. Open grey eyes were glaring at the ceiling, his mouth ajar in a stale grimace of pain, his long silver tattered hair scattered about his face and cheeks. Her breaths rushed at her in a quick succession of waves. She became frantic, a young lost girl in an unforgiving world again, and thus she quickly turned back to the mirror and continued braiding her hair, yet unable to face a harsh reality. The harsh reality lay beside her. Her heart was racing. She bit down on her lip and stared deeply into those cold, dark eyes of hers. Who was she now he was gone? Hierophant Relafane was all she genuinely cared for. Oh, along with Vestige, of course. The violent thrashing of horse hoofs soon broke her from that deadly stare with the lady in the mirror. Neighs followed. The hoofs slowed to a halt, and the commotion could be heard outside. There was a gasp, or a shriek, a despairing question asked of any who could answer perhaps. She missed the words, but was certain the voice belonged to Cavalian. The front door of a small school could be heard opening downstairs and slamming hard. Next, ascending footsteps pounded on the stairs no less frantically than the horse hoofs moments ago. Esther's cries ceased for a moment, and Ortico could be heard saying something, but there was no response heard from Cavalian, and she, who had anticipated the entrance the moment she had heard the neighs, no less jolted on her stepfather's chair when Cavalian finally burst through the door. "Harrison! Harrison!" he said, breathed breathlessly as he approached fleetingly, glistening sweat oozing down his forehead and shaggy brown hair. Thin sideburns were draped along the side of his long, thin face, making for an even thinner visage. But there was worry too now, a concern for the darker shades of the unknown that had now visited upon the only father figure he had ever known. He had ever had. I swear it's because I'm moved. That is the loveliest smell of toilet roll I've ever had. I've never smelled toilet roll before, but that is apparently the shit. Unless it's my shit on a toilet roll and I've just... Oh, God. Oh. The door closed on his own cloak, impeding his march. Ferally, he tore away the brooch and cast it on the floor ruinously. Aurelil saw only fear and concern in Cavalian, and she only slightly began to move herself and to inform him of the dreadful news. But Cavalian was not focused on her at all, and only sought to reach Haraphan's side. "Haraphan!" he said again. This time his voice was louder. It was dry and coarser than usual, no doubt for the ordeal of his swift return so fast. Aurelil's eyes narrowed and her dark brows angled banefully, but she quickly stowed away her anger for the time being. Cavalian leered over Haraphan, but it was not the look of an ailing, old, resting man that he was expecting. He had clearly departed already. Cavalian beheld the lifeless grey eyes in the open mouth and the fixed, twisted visage of pain. Aurelil turned about on the chair to regard Cavalian, looking at him with her chin raised that she did not see the corpse on the bed. She found Cavalian aghast, swiping a hand through his thick brown hair, greasy curls and all. His light brown eyes, though normally narrow and as inquisitive as her own, were wide and horrified. His face, exhausted and weathered, was now racked in shock. He had not got too far from Elder's Grove when the rider had caught him up to deliver the news, but it was far enough that he had nearly beat his horse to death to be back at Haraphan's side at that fateful time. It was a time that he somehow thought would never come, but it had come, and he had not been there. "Aurelil," he breathed. "His face. You didn't... Why is he..." He placed a hand over his mouth and turned away from the sight. But a moment later he turned about and found his foster father still staring upwards through the ceiling. He stepped forward to Haraphan, and with an almost impolite nudge to the late man's chin, closed his dried mouth. Then a brief, emotionless, gentle stroke across the dead man's eyes sealed his lids. Cavalian linked his hands behind his head as he turned away again. Oh, hang on. Something's happened. Oh, God. The computer's being crap. Sorry about that. They haven't disappeared. We're back. He turned away again. "You could have closed his eyes," was all Cavalian could muster. "Why didn't you?" Aurelil shook her head a moment in a loss for words and braved a smile, but it didn't take long for that very same smile to fall from its stage. Her face shriveled, her sky-blue eyes shut hard, and her cheeks flared redder. Tears broke and trickled down her forlorn face. "Why didn't I what? What happened to him? I was not gone for a day. What happened?" Cavalian's voice seemed void of any heartbreak. Aurelil swallowed hard to wet her dried, paining throat. "They don't know. They will try to find out." "What do you mean they will try to find out?" Cavalian yelled. "Who's they? Rudyard and the Khan?" He's fucking scouse as fuck, this one. "They'll know straight away. What's to wait for? How did this happen? He was fine when I left him." Aurelil flew from her chair, eyes wielding great perils and with more wind blasting from her lungs than any would believe she could contain. Her rage was complete. Was he really? Fine after you left him, you say? The man was stuck in this room crying for hours, Cavalian. You broke his heart. He died from a broken heart. From an argument with me. That'll do it. Yeah, that'll do it. Careful, Aurelil. You might die yourself. And perhaps I'll leave you to eyes gawk at the webs in the ceiling when you do. Aurelil found she was struck in the stomach hard. His words had knocked the wind out of his sails, and given how he did not pursue them, it was clearly he had little to add either. He pointed at her accusingly, but there were simply no words. Cavalian stormed back towards the door. Before he even reached it, the portal swung open at the behest of his command over magic. Behind it, Ortego could be seen scrambling Estage into the boy's room, closing the door behind him. As Cavalian exited, the Arcanist weaved the same arcane spell to slam the door shut behind him. Aurelil shrunk back down on the chair and began weeping uncontrollably, while Cavalian could be heard storming down the stairs. But then, next, a great crash from the ground floor, then another. Terrible, violent roars and yells came from below. She had seen Cavalian in some bouts of anger, but she had never heard him as thus. He could only have been tearing up the school. She was terrified to find what extent personally, but a moment later, her defiance and anger outweighed her fear of Cavalian. She shot from the chair and made for the door herself. Seconds later, she was stood at the top of the stairs, glaring down where she could see the staring mess for the whims of a raging storm called Cavalian. Pack that in now, she railed at him. You're terrifying, Estage, and this is still Hierophant's home. She galloped down the stairs as she shrieked at him. One bookshelf had been thrown to the ground. One chair was broken, another shattered. Cavalian stood in the centre of the room and seemed oblivious to her beckoning. With a wave of his arm, the bookshelf rose again, only for him to conjure a weave to see it fly and smash into the wall, disintegrating it completely. Even before the books landed on the ground, Cavalian saw that they then flew outwards in many directions and onto the walls. Aurelil caught one in the side of her head as it passed. The untold rage on Cavalian's face indicated the man had completely snapped, or he hadn't even noticed he'd hit her. Stop it! She screamed at him. Saw his coming was sure to hurry themselves out of his way. Others who were curious and did not see him, he dragged aside by the shoulders. Others more skeptical of the arcane arts were alarmed and angered upon hearing the carnage quickly unfolding within, and were rushing to the door to put themselves to use. These he barked at, and more than one he edged aside with his staff and a warning glare. He reached the door, shoving aside a final duo of druids before entering himself. He burst through the door. The contrast of a beautiful day outside and a dimly lit interior were poles apart. The curtains were closed. Aurelil was screaming at Cavalian, beckoning him to stop, with half-hearted calls from Ortego insisting he do the same. Amidst it all, Estage was heard wailing upstairs, and books and more chairs slammed against the walls. The table shook menacingly. Cavalian himself was raising another chair as he weaved the weaves of the arcane. The elder did not give him the courtesy of words, and simply barged into the young man, crossing Cavalian's neck with his staff, wielded in one surprising strong hand. He rushed the unbalanced and surprised Arcanist backwards until he slammed against the wall, where the old elder pinned him. Aurelil, the door! He yelled. Aurelil wasted no time, and a split moment later, her trembling hands were on the handle of the door. Wait! Came a frantic call. Hopping up from behind the shoulders of two burly druids was Mondone. Let me back in! There was little good Mondone could bring to the happenings there and then, so with not so much as a glance to him, she slammed shut the door in the face of angry druids who were intent on following Akan into the commotion. She hastened to lock it and then snapped her glare back on the elder, whose face was inches from Cavalian's, wearing a wrath perhaps on par with Cavalian's own. She was just in time to see Akan blowing a powder of some sort from his staff that forced Cavalian to shut his eyes and wince. You hear me now, Cavalian? Akan growled dangerously and quietly that the druids outside would not hear more of the drama. Hierophant has dedicated what he could of his life to this school, and I'll not see it dragged apart brick by brick now because of your antics. Do you understand? Cavalion's furious brown eyes narrowed dangerously in line with the rest of the sneer that had formed across his face. But as the powder worked its way into his pumping lungs, the rage installed a moment, and then there was horror. His eyes closed hard once again, and his head lowered it to a bow. The Khan took a deep breath. "Are you all right, Orlil?" he asked of a woman over her shoulder. The tearful woman nodded initially before she realized he could not see such a gesture staring so close into Cavalion's face as he was. Her voice croaked. "I am." By Khan's reckoning, she was far from it, but it would have to do for now. "Breaking as things, terrifying gestage. We all heard, boy, but it is wholly unacceptable." He leant back away from Cavalion, who he still had pinned, but only to point his fingers at Aurelil, whom both saw was quakingly descending onto what was now a three-legged chair, holding her chest in anxiety, whose cheek was seeping blood. "Look what you did to her!" For a man who was now shedding tears, there was still little sorrow on Cavalion's face. It was sneers and snarls and rage. "I didn't mean to hurt." "Of course you didn't," Khan hissed, pinning him harder to the wall, but briefly so. "But you did. That's all that matters right now, in this very moment. Time will tend to that, and you'll make it right. But I will not have you here now. I will not have you in here right now. Take your friends from the west and leave. I will not admit you back within Elder's Grove until midnight." "That's not fair," Cavalion began to argue, wide-eyed and panicking so soon after a day of nigh breaking his horse to be there. He was now to be turned away, but Hakan was quick to silence him. "Scaring Gestage was not fair. What you've done to Orwell isn't fair. This scene you have made to the druids outside is not fair on Harafin and all the blood and sweat and tears he shed to make it so. You will leave. You will reflect and calm yourself down. Take those other arcanists outside, far away from here. Their being here is not helping the situation. You just be gone. This conversation is over." Finally, he released his firm grasp of Cavalion, who was now looking more forlorn by the second. "Orville, No!" Khan pressed relentlessly, not giving him such as a moment to gather his thoughts. Khan imagined Cavalion would by now be swelling with shame and self-loathing and would have some genuine words of apology for Aurelil. Still, he was also firm in his belief that Aurelil would not so soon be ready to hear or accept them. "He can stay," Aurelil uttered from behind him. Khan turned to stare at her side on. "He may not." Cavalion looked back to Khan. He appeared calmer already, but the elder's aggressive gaze was to silently detail to Cavalion a final time that his hand should have already been closing the door behind him. Cavalion glumly turned away after a silent moment of pause and dared not to look at the mess. Khan observed him leave. The distraught fellow cast a wry grin up the stairs from where Estage could be heard screaming still, and then a brave glance as he could went to Aurelil. He could look no higher than her knees for his shame. Moments later, Cavalion unlocked the door and opened it. There came jeers and curses from people, but his only repercussion was to slam the door behind him. Elder Khan propped his staff against the wall, with little regard for either, and then dashed to Aurelil with his eyes stuck on her injury. I'm struggling to read this, I do apologise. She stiffened up as he approached as if Khan was a Cavalion once more, but the elder's touch, however fast, was still gentle. He cupped her chin in his cold hands, and turned her to view the wound. His head quickly shifted from one vantage point to the other. He peered closely and far, and then finally turned her to face him. He had an inkling that she was very intimidated by his stern presence, but he had never done her any harm. Conclusively, a smile broke, and he held her hands to his chest and finally loosed a smile. "I'm sure you'll be fine, my dear child. I will call on Rudyard to get you cleaned up, though, and I'll tend to our dear Harafan. I'd like you to remain inside for the time being and tend to Estage when you look the part, of course. He nodded to the small cut on her head to incriminate the problem of dealing with Estage any sooner. He saw her mouth creak, open to speak, but he simply shook his head dismissively and pet her eyes with a handkerchief. Cavalian will be fine later. Of that I am certain. He'd always had a temper, but I hadn't anticipated him handling things this way. It was foolish of me not to remain here. You didn't know Harrison was... I didn't tell you. Her face creased again, and Akan simply put his finger on his lips and hushed her. He then brushed her hair and then bowed his head low and glared deeper into her eyes. How long since he let his own words trail off so as not to externalize what she clearly was not ready to hear herself. Her lips simply rolled in, and she closed her eyes and began shaking her head. The creature had no idea. Leave it to me, child. As I say, I'll send for Rodshard, but I must be quickly speak with Cavalian outside. Akan left her then and made for the door. He opened it to find mourners still about the house paying respects, and some had now begun even weeping, a relatively rare thing for Druidic mourners without blood ties. There were fewer than there were when he had entered, and that did not fill him with pleas. A quick check around, and he saw those who had left. The main crowd had gathered near the stable, where he could now just make out a Cavalian and his two guests muttering to one another. They were likely debating taking already worn horses or going about their day on foot, but the druids nearby were certainly accosting them, declaring their distaste for Cavalian and demanding he leave. At least two druids were loudly disclosing to the Arcanist how they hoped the elders would now see him and the others banished. That's enough! Akan called at them, scattering them as he neared. All but the most bitter or egotistical remained to lock stairs and scowl at Cavalian or at Akan to list the Arcanist's charges before the elder. One of these snapped at Akan. He's always been foul, elder. Only Harafan could keep him in line, another called. Don't need to be elder to see how this will end. This is no concern of yours, Akan told him calmly. I think it has, came the reply from some random Irish guy in the Welsh town. Then you quickly becoming my concern, because I want you away from here that I may speak to him alone. Now move aside and be on your way. Akan's words were verging on anguish, but his grey eyes were already there. The druids shook their heads and left, sighing in disgust. Akan turned to the side, to the mound where the willow hearth stood. Beneath it, he saw the other elderly Arcanists for so long and so vocally, even despite his approval of Harrison. Rodshard! Akan called up to the youngest elder. Tend to the house of weaving. I'll be there shortly. That said, he then finally turned to Cavalian and his unwelcome guests. Cavalian was stood in the stable, flanked by a man and a woman whom the elder had come to know as friends of Cavalian's from his days gallivanting around the Kefik dominion, or so they were believed to have. But now they were envoys on behalf of the arcane enclave in Gaelok, and had apparently been sent to the House of Weaving to poach Cavalian from Harrison. It was this notion that had led Cavalian and Harrison to a particularly bitter row the evening before, but many had now surmised that led to the latter's sudden dilapidation of health. The man, Eris, had invasive blue eyes, a common trait of the Kefik. His always seemed to flicker from place to place restlessly, and a sly half-smile constantly etched into his face. He always appeared nervous and calculating when Akan had caught a glimpse of him, and that moment was no different. The man hadn't taken his eyes off Akan as he spoke to the discontented druids moments before. He was wearing a black tunic and tight-fitting dark brown brakai. I'm going to write hose, each leg of which run down to his shin, which his tall brown boots met them. His dark hair with subtle hints of red ended in a short ponytail. The man was blessed with good looks, sharp cheekbones, and a shapely pointy chin, but his greatest blessing, many would say, was his arcane prowess. He was the first apprentice to Magister Naladraig of the Arcane Enclave, and thus not only received private tuition from the tutor but was also in many ways the Magus' assistant. His duties would go from assisting in research personally and went as far as assisting in the arrangement of studies for the rest of his budding pupils, often teaching them himself. The woman was Iris's lover, Vinea, and she was as beautiful as Iris was handsome. Dark black hair as Iris had, blushing cheeks, a mildly tanned complexion, with sharp, elegant features and powerful, tantalizing green eyes. Her posture was equally sharp and attentive, regal, some would say. She mostly remained quiet and avoided conversation with any Druids altogether, not unlike Iris. She was not an Arcanist by any means, but had still managed to enchant Iris' heart. The strangely spoken woman was a little taller than both Iris and Cavalion, who were of average height. Stood miserably between them was a deflated and grossly ashamed Cavalion. As lost as he looked, there seemed to be little melancholy about him. Akan stepped beneath the college's stable roof before Cavalion, somehow prompting Iris to put a hand on Vinea's shoulder to lead her away. "There's no need for that," the elder put to them quickly. "I'll be brief." He looked to the quaking Cavalion. "We must bury him the Druidic way, you understand. It was a wish before we fought the Drakon, and he has never said anything between now and then to make me feel his mind was ever changed in any way." Cavalion nodded faintly to him, sighing deeply as he did. The words did little to soothe him, clearly, but this he would not dispute, as he knew it as well as Akan. "And you understand that tonight they will feast in his name?" Cavalion had heard enough. Is it not enough about this body is still... Is it not enough that his body is still warm, and already they prepare for song, drink, and dance? Can that not wait? It is not our way to wait. You're lumping his remains into a swamp your way, and I have not complained. But a night of festivities on the day he died, as is our tradition. And I'm not here to lap up the revelry myself, because I'm banished until midnight. It's too much, Akan. Elder Akan, he said, subtly reminding him to honour the etiquette amongst the Druids. Elder Akan! Elder Akan! They will all be grieving, Cavalion. This is how we do it. No one will be grieving like I will, the young man snapped quite. No one will be grieving like I will, he snapped. No one will be grieving like I will, the young man snapped, quite instinctively, and slowly managing to reel in the sneer on his face. I can't let that sneer pass without word before continuing. They will all be grieving, but they will also be celebrating his life. They will shrink from the dancers and drink sadly in his name now and then. You can't fight this, Cavalion. Do not further agitate yourself. Cavalion turned his head to Iris, who picked up his eyebrows and turned away from Cavalion. Akan watched the exchange closely, understanding the hesitance and sensing the frustration. Cavalion undoubtedly loved Haraphan. This he knew, but the Druidic burial and the feast was the will of Haraphan as much as anyone else's, and Cavalion's exclusion was very much of his own making. Out of respect for his late companion, Akan would not budge on anything he'd laid out to Cavalion. He lowered his head as he leant forward to the young man. Don't fight this, lad. His voice was calm, quiet, and sympathetic, and Akan had to accept that Cavalion would not submit to any means of outward agreement by word or action. It is quite the raucous you have caused today, and you don't need to tell me that in the absence of Haraphan, this simply cannot happen. I must appease the discontent. Go, Cavalion. Return at dusk, not midnight, but no sooner. We can discuss things then, or if you prefer, in the morning. Cavalion's eyes narrowed to an invasive gaze. You don't want me to attend this funeral? Akan beheld the man for a moment, and he could see from his stooped head and still-pierced gaze that Cavalion was harbouring many reservations on many matters. But the old shaman simply shrugged. You will not be committed yet. It is just a small pilgrimage that will bear his worldly remains and departed soul to the gravesmire. You've seen plenty of them already. It won't be his burial. Burial, Cavalion mocked with a tormented grin, shaking his head. He chewed the inside of his mouth for many still moments before shaking his head. Their exchange was finished. He turned to Iris. We won't need the horses. He led up the sparrow tops for a while. The Khan hid his approval as not to add further insult to injury, but did not move from that stable until the threesome were well on their way into the surrounding trees and thickets that surrounded Elder's Grove. The shaman remained in quiet contemplation until they disappeared into those trees, with the proud fang-like trio of mountains, the sparrow tops, lorded over to the north. It would be a hard day for many people, he thought, but for Aurelill and Cavalian and the confused Estage, it was a particularly cruel one. If there was any doubt as to why Harrison had spent more time educating Cavalian on the matters of ethics more than nurturing his raw mastery over arcane, they were now cleared from Akan's mind. In his grief, Cavalian had proven to be a man harbouring a terrible fury, and it was clear Harrison had been wise in trying to instill reason into him, as opposed to further his efficiency. In his current state, he was certainly 2 steps shy from a catastrophe waiting to happen. Akan would need to find a balance in restraining him and allowing him some space to express himself. The sparrow tops would offer Cavalian that balance. Right, that's that one. I'm going to go and have another smoke and then I'll be back. 46 minutes a chapter, that's not too bad. It's not as long as I thought it would be. That's good. What's the audio quality like? Is it all right? Can you understand me? Am I mumbling at any point? I've got me sneezes and all that, but I mean, when it is going well, can you understand me? Like he says after 47 minutes of yappering. Okay, that's good. I'm having a few problems reading it. My eyes are a bit stuffy. Not a problem. I'll just crack on. I'm not trying to do it perfectly. I'm not publicising it. I'm not trying to get a big following or nothing like that. I'm just... I know. I'm so sexy with me. Harrison. You're not even talking about the other ones, are you? You know, that old sexy Harrison, hey, check out my grey locks, you little kinks. I meant to say minx. I said kinks. Work it out. But yeah, I will get people, pass it to people, but I just want to get a head start on it. I certainly want to get further than I did with the audio play. With the audio play, it was just too time consuming, and I really wanted, for an audio play, I really wanted a female voice girl to do all the female characters. I didn't want to be running around after like 5 different girls over 7 different chapters on 85 fucking different pages. So the random Irish, well, you see some Irish guys later. I think the so Avaria is all druid. All the druids have their own kind of regions, if you will. The east has got like, I don't know what's, I can't tell what's, I'm dyslexic. That's my right hand. But on my screen, it's doing my left hand. What the fuck is east and west right now? I don't know. In the far right, no, that sounds political. On the right side of Avaria, all that, it starts with Scottish. They are very, very much against the Kefik rule that's going on in the West. We'll come over to that in a minute. The West is left, by the way, for my own benefit on this camera. Then you kind of got like the central bit, which is a bit Welsh. Central part's more like Welsh. They're kind of all right with it. They don't really mind that much, but there's a lot of paranoia now because of what happened called the Restless Night, that these Kefik are bringing in necromancy, which is going to swallow all Druidic tradition and all that. So that is very rampant in the right. In the middle bit where we are, Elders Grove, it's a bit of a dispute. It's very much listening to 2 people with different political opinions shouting at each other in a pub. The middle's just very confused. It's a bit of both. And then all the way to the left or west, just still doing it right. You have pretty much a very diluted mixture of Irish, and that's been knocked on the head by Cockneys, and because the whole basis of it was actually the Troubles, like Northern Ireland and all that. There's a bit of Irish sounding characters from the East that somehow mysteriously we'll come to that later. But anyway, I'm going to go for a steak and I'm going to top up my drink and then I'll come back and do the next one. But I'll have to do a different stream for it because I'm trying to break it all up into chapters. So that's that. So I'll see you in a bit. Bye for like 10 minutes or so. See you in a bit. I say see you in a bit. Click end stream. Bye. End stream. Are you sure? Oh, for fuck's sake. Are you sure? I've just said bye. Now I'm looking around. Bye.